Welcome to a special edition of the Hub Roundtable. It's the day after the 2025 federal election. I'm joined in studio by Sean Speer, co-founder and editor-at-large. Sean, we made it 36 days.
We did. We also made it through last night, barely, but we're still standing, and so is the country.
Yeah, 76,000 people viewed our live election coverage beginning at 7 p.m. And yeah, I love this technology. I love the ability to connect with our audience. Tons of questions that came in, great guests throughout the night. So I'm going to be a little bit nostalgic in a way that the election's over. We don't have all this gear to play with each and every day. But a big thanks to the team here at the Hub for making it all possible.
Hear, hear, and our audience. One of the coolest parts about last night is we know how thoughtful our audience is, but our guests were exposed to it throughout the night. Our guests weren't merely taking questions from you and me. They were taking it from members of the Hub community, and some of them were just top notch. It was a fun night all around.
Yeah. So look, let's talk about where we land today, Tuesday morning. We have the Liberals just shy of a majority. We have the Conservatives adding a significant number of seats, but coming up short. We have the NDP decimated. Yes. They've lost official party status. Their leader has resigned. And we should add another big wrinkle, at least this morning, is Pierre Poilievre's loss of his seat in Ottawa. When you try to put that all together, that smorgasbord that we're kind of picking through this morning, what's your big takeaway about what happens next and how these various protagonists, especially Mark Carney, and I assume Pierre Poilievre, but the Conservative Party writ large, and the significant portion of Canadians that did not vote for the Liberals last night, including younger people, including much of Western Canada, locked out of this government by their choices at the ballot box. What happens next?
It's precisely the right question to ask. It's a question that all the leaders are asking themselves today. All parliamentarians are asking themselves. And those candidates who lost are asking themselves. One thing that's striking, Roger, just worth underscoring is the decline of the NDP and the extent to which it played a major role in this election. I'm thinking, for instance, of ridings like Eglinton Lawrence, where the Conservatives came just short. And the New Democrats ended up polling something like less than 2%. I mean, these are numbers that one couldn't have predicted even before last night. And so where do we go from here? It seems clear that Mark Carney is going to have a more stable government than it looked like at different points throughout the night, that he should be able to count on NDP support to essentially sustain his government for the foreseeable future, particularly in a world where New Democrats are ostensibly not going to be spoiling for much of the fight.
Leaderless.
Yeah, someone said last night that he's going to govern like he has a majority government. I think that's probably a safe bet, particularly if Pierre Poilievre stays as party leader but is locked out of Parliament until he can find himself a seat. So in that sense, we might end up with a less dysfunctional Parliament than some of us were thinking at various points last night. But make no mistake, it's unlikely that this government will be able to sustain itself for 4 years. We'll have Pierre Poilievre at some point entering Parliament, ostensibly the New Democrats establishing a leader and trying to distinguish itself from the Liberals, learning in a way the mistakes over the past 4 years. So I guess the takeaway for me is probably a pretty stable governing agenda for the foreseeable future, but don't bet on not being back where we were last night at some point in the next couple of years.
Let's talk about the Liberals and the challenge that Mark Carney faces. We can get to some of the policy challenges, and they're big ones that will land on his docket in the days to come. But the Liberals have assembled a really interesting coalition. I mean, they basically, if you believe these exit polls, they've pulled more than half of the NDP vote into their party. In cities like the GTA, they've decimated the NDP. You start wondering what this new Liberal coalition is, and it's not a coalition in Parliament. In some ways, it's much more powerful.
Yes.
It's a coalition of political preferences that have then been expressed around this party and around this very new leader who has, in 90 days, gone from zero to hero.
Yes.
Maybe that's the title of this this episode of the Roundtable. What do you make of that coalition? I guess the question I have for you, because it relates to what you were just talking about. When are we next at the polls? When is the penny likely to drop on a Liberal minority? The Liberals must be looking at this, Sean, and saying to themselves, is this the basis of a more fundamental realignment of our politics? Can we hold these NDP voters that have crossed over into our coalition? And if that's the case, if Mark Carney and the Liberal Party is going to think in that kind of strategic way, what does that mean for the policy agenda of this government? Because I'm starting to think that we've drifted a long way. We're no longer in Kansas anymore with people talking about Mark Carney as a blue Bay Street liberal from Goldman Sachs with his Brookfield chairmanship. I guess what I'm wondering about and worrying a little bit about, for the sake of better and more sane policy when it comes to the economy, is how does Mark Carney square an ambitious economic agenda for the country of reform and rejuvenation and hold together this remarkable coalition that they assembled last night?
Yeah, just a ton of insight embedded in your preamble and in your question, Roger. This isn't your father's or your grandfather's Liberal Party. This is something different. It is now a progressive party. I think
good way to put it.
There was some evidence of that when Justin Trudeau stepped down in January. You'd recall in his final press conference, he didn't address Liberals, he addressed progressives, and that accelerated in last night's result. Mark Carney, whatever his own background and preferences and all the rest, he now leads what is fundamentally a progressive party, one that is motivated about issues around climate change and a more kind of activist view about the role of government in the economy.
And let's also say, Sean, identity politics.
Yes.
Okay, so again, here's I start wondering how Mark Carney, starts to square these circles. He made some early tells. Not having gender parity in his cabinet, his campaign cabinet that he appointed, his talk at the beginning of the election more about national symbols, history,
yes,
the importance of national identity. That kind of music to my ears tuned out a bit, faded over the course of the campaign. And again, I just wonder where we've ended up. And I think you're absolutely right to use the kind of phraseology progressive as opposed to liberal, because in some ways, I see this as the expression in Canada of a much larger progressive international movement that we've seen in the United Kingdom, that we've seen in Europe, that Mark Carney in many ways has been a participant of, at least through his net zero and climate activism over the last number of years. So I wonder if we're not going to understand in the weeks and months to come that we've elected not simply a liberal minority, we've elected a progressive majority.
Yes, well said. And what's interesting, Roger, when it comes to something you reference in your comments, is that has both policy and political implications. It will inform a Carney-led government's policy agenda, the extent to which it has to be, to some extent, responsive to these new and different voters that he's brought into the party over the past several weeks. But there will certainly be people around him who see huge political opportunity here. And I go back to the example of Eglinton Lawrence. In a world in which we have a three-party system, we wake up this morning, the Conservatives hold Eglinton Lawrence. They hold a whole number of other ridings. In fact, we're probably talking about Prime Minister Poilievre.
Yeah.
And so if you just look at that in a dispassionate way, if they can, for all intents and purposes, consolidate the left in Canada on a go-forward basis.
Incredibly powerful.
The country tilts center left.
It's preferences.
9 times out of 10, that party is going to win general elections unless Conservatives do something different or Liberals, essentially do something so offensive to Canadians that they throw the bums out. And so I think that is going to be this path that the Liberals follow. How can they be sufficiently responsive to those voters that they can keep them within the tent, such that whenever they go back to the Canadian public next time around, they can secure the majority that Mark Carney, the real majority that Mark Carney wants, and that he sought to get last night.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about policy, because that's what we like here at the Hub. If we are right, and again, this is so early, but if we are right and Mark Carney, either out of choice or necessity, wants to bring these capital P progressive voters that are on the left flank of his Liberal Party and the kind of center right of the NDP, if you can talk to the NDP that way, and he wants to coalesce these people, what are we going to see from a policy prescription basis? Because I start to think back to a lot of the Trudeau era policies, which in some ways were precisely designed to hold this type of coalition together. These NDP voters who've crossed over to the Liberal Party, and just generally a cohort within the Liberal Party who over the last decade under Trudeau have increasingly given expression to the Liberal Party as a party that does have concerns about gender equity, climate, identity politics. I'm not talking about these things pejoratively. I'm just simply saying they are reasons for their political animation, for their participation in civic life and in our public institutions. So I don't know, riff off that.
Yeah, it's going to have big implications for questions, for instance, around oil and gas development. There's been a debate over the past several weeks about what, if anything, a Carney-led government might do to turn Canada into an energy superpower, something he's talked about in the campaign. Given the outcome of last night's result, given this new coalition that the party has, one that ostensibly wants to codify, cement, to effectively drive the NDP into the ground for good, that's going to influence policy decisions. Israel-Hamas. At some point, Canada is going to have to make a judgment in policy terms about whether to recognize a post-Hamas government in Gaza and how we're going to support those efforts. That's something that is going to run straight through this version of the Liberal Party as it did the Trudeau government. I mean, the list goes on, and it's going to involve these trade-offs, ones that might even conflict with Mark Carney's own political preferences. And I guess this is just a point to emphasize. One thing that I'm not sure, Roger, is how much Mark Carney sees himself as an institutional liberal. That is, someone who has an interest in advancing the broader institutional goals of the Liberal Party, or if he's kind of renting the Liberal Party to be Prime Minister. And I think there'll be people around him, those who aren't just concerned about the next 4 years, but who want to see the party effectively consolidate those gains long term, sometimes bucking up against the types of things that Mark Carney himself might want to advance as Prime Minister.
Yes, but it is a minority. He is going to need NDP members to pass legislation. There's some talk today, will NDP members cross the floor? We'll have to see about that. I tend to think that's unlikely. I think that would be the end of the NDP. It would be, to an extent, formally surrender and acknowledge the merger. So I see that as unlikely, maybe possible. But again, I guess my worry here is that Mark Carney may have had other preferences that came out through his experience as a central banker, through his time on Wall Street, through his time on Bay Street with Brookfield. I just think he now runs into a colder, harder political logic, which is, yes, there are going to be things that he wants to do, but there's going to be a running NDP toll booth that he's going to keep passing through with each budget, with each supply measure. And the NDP is going to be there holding out their coupon, waiting to be clipped. And I don't know. We'll see. And I guess this is my final point before we shift to the Conservatives. I think the other interesting thing about Carney is he has gone, again, from zero to hero in 90 days. He performed much better on the campaign, I think, than many people thought, to his credit. But now he is going to jump into the top slot in terms of political jobs in this country. That comes with not only demands from your caucus, it comes from demands from premiers who have power, real power, constitutional power in our federation. He's going to have to deal with all kinds of outside stakeholders who are going to have views and opinions and policies and priorities. And then just finally, he's going to have to deal with Quebec, because I think that's another powerful part of what happened last night.
Yes.
The Liberals did incredibly well in La Belle Province. They were, I saw, just because I'm interested in some of these ridings down in the eastern townships, that have been consistently Bloc, towns like Sherbrooke and Magog. I mean, for the Liberals to win there, again, that is significant. And how does Quebec's political preferences be expressed through, again, a Carney who might want to make Canada an energy superpower, Sean, but surely in the context of this coalition with large numbers of NDP voters, with a significant showing in Quebec, and Quebec voters completely, I think, when push comes to shove, disinterested in the idea of punching a pipeline, through their province to Eastern Tidewater. I don't know, Sean, a lot of what we talked about in this campaign seems to me to be unraveling on the basis in some ways of this electoral math and the success that has now brought Mark Carney to the cusp of a majority.
Yeah, I wish I could disagree to make it more interesting. But I agree with everything you just said. Just a couple of points, I think, to underscore in the scenario you just painted. The first is that large Quebec caucus is going to be a constant voice around Mark Carney, cautioning him not to provoke Quebecers in the face of a provincial election next year, where presently, all things being equal, the Parti Québécois is likely to win and possibly throw the country into another referendum. And what he'll be hearing from his large cohort of Quebec MPs is that we need to tread carefully. We need, in a way, to, if forced, kind of preference Quebec and its own bias rather than other parts of the country in a kind of zero-sum way. Secondly, notwithstanding some of the gains that the Liberals made with NDP voters and in Quebec and all the rest, it underperformed expectations in Western Canada. There had been talk in recent days that it was going to make these inroads in Calgary and Edmonton, and in fact, they lost members of parliament. Yeah. The Edmonton mayor, someone who Carney had really cultivated, I think if he's with him, soon after becoming leader and prime minister, a former Liberal minister lost. He lost his seat last night. And so if you think about it in a kind of shrewd way, and if we've learned anything about Mark Carney over the past several weeks, he's shrewder than people thought. There is a kind of raw calculus that goes into it. And so because of this new progressive base that the party has, because of its over-indexation for the province of Quebec, because of Mark Carney's own sort of preferences when it comes to net zero and so on, I think there's a world in which a lot of the talk that we saw earlier in the campaign about energy superpower and building pipelines and all the rest,
last mile,
dissipates in a new Carney government, and that could be a major source of tension, of course, across the country.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break because we got to pay some bills here with some ads, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll come back on the other side and talk, Sean, about the Conservatives and where they find themselves this morning, Tuesday. So back to you in just a moment. Welcome back to the Hub Roundtable for the second half of the show. We're going to talk about the Conservatives now, Sean. Pierre Poilievre losing his seat, a major disappointment. Conservatives, again, underperforming in 416, but to the credit of Darryl Bricker, our pollster, who was hypothesizing, in the days leading up to the campaign that the Liberal strength could be in the provincial numbers really been over-indexed and captured because of what was going on in the GTA. The Conservatives actually picking up seats in 905. Yeah.
Essentially for the first time since 2011.
Yeah. And adding seats overall, a significant number of seats.
More than the Liberals.
Yes. A much bigger caucus, but not enough. Yes. At, what was it, 145 or 144 was a few just remaining seats left undecided. So where do you see the Conservatives at? Because they too have in a sense created aspects of a new coalition, but have also once again clearly rooted and grounded themselves as a Western party in their complete dominance, not just of Alberta and Saskatchewan, but I think, again, surprisingly strong performance in British Columbia.
Yes. Yeah, if you look at the map.
Yeah, let's get that map up.
It really is something, isn't it?
Here we are.
You just go blue, basically from the Lakehead, where I'm from, right to the Pacific Ocean by and large. The Conservatives can tell themselves a pretty good story out of last night's campaign, pick up seats, I think broke the party's record for share of the popular vote, well north of 40%. this new composition, younger voters, blue-collar voters, new and different ridings across the country. So that's the positive story, and that's certainly the story that Pierre Poilievre is going to be talking about in the coming days in making the case that he ought to stay on and be given another chance. I think the less positive story in some ways is the flip of what we were just talking about with the Liberals, which is to say the Conservatives have learned if we are indeed in a two-party world because the Liberals have successfully consolidated the left, 42% of the popular vote ain't going to cut it.
No, amazing.
And
just explain again how challenging north of 40 is in terms of electoral math for the Conservatives going back multiple elections.
One thing that's just extraordinary is that last night, the combined Liberal-Conservative vote, the concentration of popular support between the two major parties, was the highest it's been since 1930. You know, the story that we used to tell ourselves about having a multi-party system, at least as last night bared out, is no longer true. We have two major parties, and then we have some fringe parties on the margin, of which now the NDP is one. And so the question for Pierre Poilievre, if I was in the caucus, the question I would put to him in him seeking my support to continue on is, how do you get beyond 42%? And how do you do it in a way that doesn't involve major compromises in conservative ideas and conservative values? Because it's not.
Is that possible though, Sean? I mean, is that having your cake and eating it too? I mean, he's pushed up. He pushed the ceiling up.
Yes.
And I mean, can it go higher without, again, the Conservative Party having to, I don't know, transform themselves into kind of blue liberals in order to go any higher north of it? Like, are the country's political preferences writ large simply more to the center left of the spectrum as government has grown, as increasing numbers of people are on public payrolls, as corporations and many businesses are increasingly regulated and managed and are extensions, in a sense, of the government's policy preferences expressed for their industry? Add up the entire near state of hospitals, education, the whole arts and community.
The media.
I'll say that quietly. The media. I mean, I go on, and I just wonder, why isn't 42 the high watermark?
My worry, Roger, as you know, is that so first of all, that's a completely legitimate argument, and there no doubt will be people who make that argument in the coming days. My hesitation is there's a big risk that if the party makes that type of adjustment, that it starts to bleed support on its right. You know, that it managed to drive down the People's Party last night to a number where it wasn't a player in virtually every part of the country. But either under Pierre Poilievre or a different leader, if he or she was inattentive to the party's base, if I can put it that way, the risk is you start to bleed support such that the gains that you're making on the party's kind of left flank, if I could put it that way, are offset by losses on the right flank. And so I don't know. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer. But this is the question: is it messenger? Is it message? Is it ideas? Is it strategy? Is it tactics? But the key is, basically, in my lifetime, the Conservative Party has relied on the idea that if it got to something like 38% of the popular vote, the NDP would do the rest.
Yes.
And I think what we've been talking about today, what we've essentially been talking about all campaign, is that can no longer be an assumed part of the party strategy. It can no longer outsource its political future, political destiny to the NDP. And so I hope that is the conversation that Pierre Poilievre's having. As I say, if I was a member of the caucus, that's what I would be putting to him. Great job. You got us to 42. That's not going to cut it. How do we get higher than that without becoming Doug Ford? I think that's the question that is going to loom over Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party between now and the next election.
Let's talk about his loss of the seat, because it creates some problems. The Liberals can wait up to 6 months before declaring a by-election once a member has resigned. They've got to find somebody who's willing to step down. I guess that's possible. In other words, he could be out of Parliament, for the balance of 2025 and only take up his seat, in the first quarter of next year. How consequential is that not to have your leader, especially when Pierre Poilievre, one of his core strengths was he was such an effective operator in the House. He led the party from the front bench, not from outside. He was an active parliamentarian in every way.
Yeah. I don't want to try to put lipstick on a pig here. But I was thinking about this a lot last night into the morning. I wonder if you could make a persuasive case that maybe it's not the worst thing. One thing that Jason Kenney said on our show last night was that Pierre Poilievre was so effective as opposition leader in a way. In the minds of a lot of Canadians, he was vying for the job of official opposition leader. The same goes, incidentally, for Tom Mulcair in 2015. Yep. Everyone talked about how effective he was at holding the Harper government to account as a parliamentary performer, but it did nothing for him in the election ultimately. In fact, arguably, in a way, it came to shape how people thought of him. And so I don't know. Maybe there's a case that it's good for Pierre Poilievre to get out of Parliament for a while, which is inherently antagonistic and inherently oppositional, in a way reinforces the kind of negative way people think about him. Permit others to step up and do that and travel the country and meet people and talk to people and let them in, something we've talked a lot about in the next couple of days. I don't know.
A listening tour.
Maybe I'm sugarcoating it, but I think Pierre Poilievre needs to overcome his unfavorability, and maybe by not electing him last night, the voters of Carleton are giving him a chance to do something of a makeover. Especially if we're right, and this is actually going to be a pretty stable minority/majority, maybe there's not a reason to be in Parliament for the next little while.
Yeah. As we wrap this up, big issues coming down the pipe. We're going to have potentially a desire by the Carney government to move forward quickly with negotiations with the United States around some kind of renewed trade agreement, whatever that is.
Yes.
We're going to have to, I think, very soon deal with an eruption of frustration, let's call it that, out of Western Canada, based on the fact that their political preferences, once again, 3 times now, 3 different Conservative leaders coming forward, each of them posing to represent those preferences, each of them failing to do so. Danielle Smith supposedly will be making comments in the days to come. So we've got a unity file brewing. We've got the Trump file brewing. And there's a feeling out there that the Canadian economy itself is either in recession or is slowing down as a result of tariffs, but also possibly as a result of just the economic malaise of the last extended period catching up to us. This is a lot, isn't it, to land on one prime minister's desk in the space of the next 90 days? Yeah.
If you think about it, our previous 2 prime ministers, in hindsight, inherited pretty good conditions. Justin Trudeau inherits a pretty good economy under Stephen Harper, not great, but pretty good. A global environment that is generally favorable to Canadian interests. A state of play on national unity that isn't perfect, similarly, but pretty good. And the same goes for Harper, inheriting a good balance sheet from the Chrétien and Martin, et cetera, et cetera. He is inheriting a really tough environment. And so there's various things I could say in response to how you set that up. Let me take it in a slightly different direction than you might think, and I'd be interested in your reaction. One of the things that I really liked about this campaign is, for the first time, it seems to me, in a long time, we're seeing business try to push its way back into the public conversation. That for the past several years, both on the left and the right, we've had a kind of populism that has been instinctively anti-business. And in some ways, in the face of that, businesses have ceded the public square, I think to the detriment of the policy conversation. And so, the Business Council of Alberta put out a lot of policy thinking in the lead up to this election campaign.
RBC, which we work with.
Exactly.
Advertiser.
And so I'm hopeful, Roger, that what we've seen from the business community in recent months is going to persist after the election, that they are going to kind of force their way into the public conversation, not in a top-down way that fails to kind of learn the lessons of the past decade, but brings evidence to bear, brings the perspective of their employees, et cetera, in a way that hopefully pushes back against something we've talked a lot about at the Hub, which is the inattention to the biggest challenge facing the country, which isn't Trump, which isn't all of these things. It's the fact that we aren't growing fast enough, that we don't have enough investment, that our productivity is declining, that our living standards are declining. If we solve for those issues, it doesn't solve for everything else, but it's a necessary condition for people to feel better about the country, to feel better about their own circumstances, to feel better about Canada's future. And so I like what we've seen from the business community in recent months, and I hope they stay with it after this election.
Yeah. My final comment, we talked about this before coming on air. If you look at the 5-year Canadian government bond, which mortgage rates are pegged off, it is the same today as when the Bank of Canada began this rate cutting cycle back in September.
Yes.
So mortgage costs, despite well over 200 basis points of front-end cuts by the Bank of Canada, has not moved Canadians' most important benchmark to measure their debt obligations against. Why do I mention this? Because Donald Trump over the last few weeks has run into something called the bond vigilantes, and we have seen violent moves in the Treasury market and speculation of a kind of a potential for the mismanagement of the American economy and its trade relations in ways that permanently resets American borrowing costs higher at a moment when debts and deficits are very high in the U.S. I guess my concern in the months to come under this Carney government is with all those files on the desk, with the political coalition that he's assembled, I worry, Sean, that the most easy, expedient, and in a sense, there may be an economic justification for it if we are slipping into recession, will be to unleash a flood of debt-financed political spending. And I just think as we talk about this is the hub, it often feels like a very lonely conversation about warning people about debts and deficits. We are not a reserve currency. We have seen the government of Quebec recently downgraded. Ontario's, has the highest per capita debt ratio of any subnational government in the world based on its population. There's lots of things under the surface here that, in the context of the Americans, have been exploded and exposed over the last few months. And I just hope for all of our sakes that the business community, others in the hub community, can start to kind of lean in here a bit and constrain what I think will be a response of this Carney government to crank the spigot open, to flood the zone with government-funded programs, government-funded, industry supports, tariff spending. There is going to be a tsunami, I think, of fiscal stimulus that's going to flow across this country. It'll have big political consequences, but I think it'll also have big economic consequences.
Yeah, well said. As you say, when you're dealing with these coalitional dynamics, oftentimes the path of least resistance is to borrow. But as we'll set out in the next couple of days for a piece that we've been working on at the Hub, debt service costs in the next 4 years are projected to hit 12 cents of every dollar the government brings in revenue, and that probably is conservative because, as you say, there's upward pressure on our borrowing costs. It will represent in the next couple of years our debt service costs, that is, more than 100% of GST revenue that we're bringing in. So we've been telling ourselves for a long time, best balance sheet in the G7. We have a lot of fiscal capacity, blah, blah, blah.
Marketing says
and that has come to, I think, justify and create a kind of complacency around deficits and debt. And at some point, that complacency bucks up against the reality of the bond vigilantes, as you say, and the growing absorption of our scarce resources, not going to the stuff that people care about, but going to pay down
and crowding out private capital, making private capital and private investment more expensive. It would be very ironic if in this minority Liberal government, Mark Carney, in a sense, has to become the central banker that he was. That we court the very kind of forces and problems that he normally would have had to deal with on the other side of the fence, as opposed to an active politician. Sometimes life can be Shakespearean. Pick your Greek tragedy. I don't know, but I think these are some of the big issues we'll continue to unpack here at the Hub over the months to come. So thank you, viewers, for tuning into this special edition of the Roundtable. We're going to make it available, the full-length episode, to our entire community, just to wrap up last night's events for you. And head over to the website today, www.thehub.ca. We've got all kinds of great continuing coverage popping up. And we'll be back with the regular Roundtable on Friday. Until then, bye-bye.